the coup that started Friday night, got the world in a tizzy, and was over by Saturday morning, initiated by Prigozhin, Prigozhin, I think is his proper pronunciation, who is the leader of the Wagner Group. Apparently, Prigozhin might have had some headbutting with another military leader named Shoigu, and gets fed up and says, I'm going to march on Moscow. The Russian military is not treating us properly. They're not giving us proper ammunitions. They're setting us up for failure. Before we get into any of the coup issue, a little backdrop, I guess, might be useful on the Wagner Group and on Prigozhin. Apparently, I don't think it's up for discussion. He's a bad man. I mean, I think everybody can agree that he's a bad man, leader of a mercenary group, kind of like Blackwater, but I guess with more of a license to kill than Blackwater. What is the Wagner Group? Who's Prigozhin? And what the heck just happened between Friday night and Saturday morning?
Well, I think much of the interpretation that ended up being wrong, by almost all the Western analysts about what was happening in Russia is predicated upon some of those incorrect assumptions about who is Wagner, who is Prigozhin, who is Putin, what is the Russian military, what is the Russian state. Indeed, I think, the net effect of all of what happened made Putin's position stronger, made Russia's position stronger in Ukraine, and weakened the West and weakened the Ukrainian position at the end of the day. I have a hush-hush up on the different alternative interpretations that could be proffered for what took place and transpired. But the irrefutable conclusion is that the West has no clue what's going on in Russia. They misunderstood it, misinterpreted it, misapplied it, and reacted poorly in response to it. Same with the Ukrainians themselves, but definitely in NATO circles, definitely in U.S. political circles, definitely in the social media and other circles. The one interpretation of people like Prigozhin and others is that he's not who the West imagines him to be. In other words, not really a bad guy, more of a marketing guy, more of just a business guy playing a role, and that he's been portrayed. 1 minute he's the evil villain, mastermind of human rights violations for the vicious Wagner Group. The next minute he's the heroic coup leader who's going to return liberal democracy to Russia in the end of Ukraine. The fact that you could have within 24 hours high-profile voices in the West give you both the same people often give you the two polar opposite definitions of an individual should tell you that these people have no idea who he is. They have no idea what's happening in Russia. They have no idea who Putin is. And I think Putin is using this to his great benefit. The fact, by many reasons, some of the more informed interpretations out there, there was reason to believe from day one that Prigozhin wasn't staging a coup, that Prigozhin had been a fountain of deliberate disinformation to the Ukrainians especially, but now the West writ large, in order to sucker them into making tactical errors and mistakes. And what was extraordinary to me was it kept working. People kept taking him at face value, even when. So whatever you do, please don't come into Bakhmut. You should go and attack all of our weak, vulnerable defenses along a line that goes from the equivalent of Chicago to New Orleans. So, that's where you should be attacking. Whatever you do, please don't come to Bakhmut. What do the Ukrainians do for 6 months? They go into Bakhmut, becomes a meat grinder. And during the same 6 months, the Russians are allowed to build several lines of defenses along those lines that they didn't have before, get their troops back up to the number and volume that they needed, which they didn't have at the time. And the spring offensive delayed until summer gave the Russians a huge edge, and it appears a big role in that was people in Ukraine and the West taking Prigozhin at face value. Various times in the Battle of Bakhmut, he would say, geez, we're about to get taken out. So a bunch of Ukrainians would rush in and get wiped out. And then he keeps doing it. After the Battle of Bakhmut, he's like, geez, the Russian military is all weak. It's terrible. Whatever you do, please, Lord, man, Ukrainians are just going to take us out if you do a big counteroffensive now, launch it in summer. And so they spend 3 weeks losing tens of thousands of men, losing at least hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. They're making trade-offs like, we'll take this farmhouse from the Russians in exchange for 10 dead troops, 2 lost tanks, and 1 lost armored carrier. You would think after all of that, the West would be realized, maybe let's not take Prigozhin at face value. Let's not assume what appears to be happening is definitely what's happening. But what does Prigozhin do? Takes his Wagner troops, heads down to Rostov, purportedly takes over a building for which there's only very limited evidence. Then starts saying he's going to replace Shoigu, and he's has a march for justice, and drives up the Moscow highway. Putin comes out and gives this dramatic speech. This is 1917 all over again. The Bolshevik Revolution is here. The outsiders and the Westerners are trying to slice up Russia just like they did with the Bolshevik Revolution. By the way, the biggest land lost during the Bolshevik Revolution was Ukraine. Just a little historical FYI. So, not a coincidence he's making that historical analogy. And while there's no conflict going on, no evidence of any conflict, right? The so-called coup is taking place, so-called martial law is going to be instituted, so-called mutiny. There, oddly, no Russian troops are battling them. We see no actual kinetic warfare, as some of the more astute observers were pointing out. And instead, they clear the highway and they just start driving up the highway. Supposedly, they're approaching Moscow. The coup is here. Russia is collapsing. Putin is done. The Ukrainian war is over. And it's like, do you really? I mean, it's like, are you people all buying this at face value? Do you think Russia's so insecure, so weak, so ready to collapse that it's honestly openly letting Wagner march right into Moscow to do a mutiny or coup? Because Prigozhin is not just some mid-tier, low-level former Soviet criminal turned entrepreneur who's built his entire financial fortune by being buddies with Putin, who's never been in politics his entire life, never cared about public life in his entire life, never been connected to the military in a meaningful manner. He was always the face in front of Wagner. Wagner was created by Russian intelligence and the Russian military to replicate the U.S. success with Blackwater and like-minded groups. So the idea that now he's this secret, super great, brilliant general, military leader, war criminal one day, liberator the next, that with 5,000 troops in an unattacked convoy to Moscow is waging a coup. And what it did is it outed a lot of people and smoked out. It was a stress test of the Russian system to see whether the Western coup could work, and it failed. It showed how bad it was. But the fact the whole West still doesn't get it, still doesn't understand who Putin is, doesn't understand the fact there's no chance of a coup in Russia because 80% of the people love Putin in Russia because the military structure is the one he put in place. The new oligarchs with economic power are the ones that have Putin to thank for being in power. You're talking about a guy whose consistent approval rating has been over 60% for more than a year, for a quarter of a century. No other leader in the entire world has sustained that for 2 years or longer in any government in the world. And yet we're pretending he's an autocrat. We're pretending he's a dictator. We're pretending he's a collapsed idiot. We're pretending, and during this, the inside reporters said he'd fled to St. Petersburg. No, he's fleeing to Kazakhstan. No, Kazakhstan is turning him back. No, he has cancer. Even my friend Alex Jones got this completely wrong because everybody keeps reading Western press and Western analysts. This was the biggest crock of all time, the biggest joke of a coup in world history, and the entire West got trolled into giving up a lot of intel and information that they never should have because they don't understand Russia, they don't understand Putin, they don't even understand Wagner and Prigozhin.
Robert, when people were saying he's marching on Moscow and they're taking the highways, and I'm sitting there thinking, look, it's not as though Russia doesn't have planes and they could literally just blast whatever convoy, whatever's marching up there. But so you hear that. And then you also hear that apparently Prigozhin is doing this because the Wagner Group has lost, if not half, 2/3 of its original 20,000 forces, so much so that they have to go get prisoners from jail, promise them freedom if they fight and survive for more than 6 months. And yet he's going to take that, march up the highways to Moscow to overtake Putin without the idea that they just get annihilated along the way. So here's the question. People are hypothesizing that this was something of a coordinated false flag between Prigozhin and Putin. Some are saying, however, things have been said that can't be unsaid, and Prigozhin comes out and says there's going to be a new president of Russia. You can't take that back. Seriously, not. It's all.
Well, if you're going to stress that, put it this way: if Putin really believed he said that, Prigozhin would be in jail.
Or
not
I'd just
hanging
say,
out
I would
in-
imagine dead. I mean, it would be easier.
or
just to
either
kill
way.
him.
But instead, he's hanging out in Belarus. Right. So if you're going to get people to come out, if you're going to rat out, we now know what I suspected had put in the hush hush at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. So if you want a fuller, deeper dive, you can go there for the broader context, the relevant historical analogous context of MacArthur and Truman that could be applicable, because that's the official narrative. That appears to be the script they're going by. You could go by, Apocalypse Now and Colonel Kurtz. You could go by the idea that he's a Western plant, or you could go by the idea that he's a Putin plant. And I explained the different alternative narratives, the arguments for each one, and which one I lean towards as being the most likely. Put it up on our board, and the board was almost evenly split, but leaned towards the Putin ploy, because members of our board have followed the story in Russian news much better, with better filters and better framework, because our board's above average, than the average Western commentator. So there were so many telltale indicators that this was not what it looked like. It required everybody acting against their self-interest in irrational ways. And it's like, assume that's not the most likely explanation. But how do you get the West taking the bait? We now know, for example, intelligence was involved, Western intelligence. How do we know? They leaked to their favorite publication, the Washington Post, that they'd been telling Congress this was going to happen 2 weeks ago, which means they were in contact with Prigozhin, which means I wonder if that's where some of the $6 billion went. I mean, they're laughing all the way to the bank in Russia. If that turned out to be the case, these are people Putin is brilliantly using the West misunderstanding of Russia, misunderstanding of Putin, misunderstanding of the military, misunderstanding of Wagner, badly against the West, to their detriment, to Ukraine's detriment. What some people said, why would you do this? Real easy. If you want to stress test your society to see how strong it is, imagine if you could have done a simulated run on January 6th. You would know what to do and what not to do to make sure it didn't backfire against Trump. Here, the West has made very clear their goal is to overthrow Putin, to have regime change in Russia, to use Ukraine to do so. So if you're Putin and you want to stress test where his weak links are, no better way than to have your lifelong buddy, who you've made a billionaire, play the role. And for that, he's got to be believable, right? He's got to go out there and say all the things the West wants to hear. He's got to attack Putin. He's got to attack the Russian military. He's got to be leading this high-end elite Wagner. Anybody who thinks he's really leading Wagner doesn't understand who and what Wagner is and who their members are. Prigozhin is a figurehead. He's not really running Wagner. Never was. He was put in there because he does his duty to help Putin in whatever capacity Putin wants. That's been his career since he got out of Soviet prison as a low-level thief in the early 1990s, started his little hot dog stand in grocery stores. And who made him rich? Putin did, by giving him exclusive licenses for gaming operations in St. Petersburg. I mean, this is the Internet Research Agency guy, right? This is the guy that was trying to use a Russian troll army to see if they could have social media influence in the U.S. It was a total failure. Mueller made the mistake of indicting the Internet Research Agency, and whatever was in those files, they had to shut down the entire case. Either their evidence was crap or there was other embarrassing information. But it looks to me like the West got played, and they got badly played, and Ukraine got played. And while all this was going on, Russia was able to move 25,000 plus troops right into Belgorod. Nobody paying any attention because it looked like they were following Wagner instead, and they just made a little detour. And he was able to restation Wagner and a bunch of troops in Belarus in ways that people think is just about a Wagner deal, not about dealing with Ukraine. And has Lukashenko come in and save the day at the end. I mean, this is so scripted. It's obvious to those who've been following Putin or Russia for any extended time period. This is a guy who has survived, who is the only modern leader in the world to take out his own pre-existing deep state and oligarchic elite, like he did in the early 2000s, and oppose the entire Western deep state empire national security apparatus successfully for the better part of a quarter century. Do you think this guy's a stumbling idiot who suddenly is subject to being overthrown overnight and is going to flee on a plane to Kazakhstan. These are people who are they're so hateful of Putin and Russia that they cannot see it through honestly. And Putin is using their hate against them.
And for those who don't know, Prigozhin, 15 years ago, a hot dog vendor, became Putin's private chef for 6 to 7 years.
No, what is he had a catering business? That's why they started calling him Putin's chef. He himself's not a chef. He runs a catering business. But all of his money, what Putin did is he replaced he told the old oligarchs, you're going to pay a little bit in tax, you're going to quit stealing, but you can keep what you've already stolen as long as you keep your head down politically, quit interfering with Russian society. And those that didn't end up having to leave Russia, got an involuntary ticket to Siberia for a little vacation there, or ended up dead. The rest of the old oligarchs understood, left. Most of them left Russia and just enjoyed their wealth in Europe. He created a new set of oligarchs loyal to him because he made them wealthy by access to the state. But the difference was they had to be loyal to the Russian people. They had to make money and give power back to the Russian people. They could not strip assets for Western interest anymore like the old oligarchs did in the 90s. And Prigozhin's one of those new oligarchs. So his entire wealth is derivative. He's patriotic in his own way, but he's not like an obsessive patriot. He's never been political in his life. I mean, all of this was so obvious. The only way you could accept Prigozhin as along the scripted line he was giving was if you hate Putin and Russia so much that you don't understand them. But that's what we're seeing now with the West. All these so-called experts look like a complete joke in 24 hours. And that's because they don't understand Russia. They don't understand Putin. They don't understand the Russian government. Almost nobody running. I mean, Bobby Kennedy can be decent at times. Donald Trump, I think, has a better understanding than most for sure. But almost nobody in the West has an honest understanding of Putin or an honest understanding of Russia. And the last 24 hours prove that for the world to witness.
Let me see if I can bring up. I'll bring up just a Vindman's. It was Alexander Vindman, whoever told me that. Thank you. This was June 24, 220. We've entered the inevitable. Oh, this was his pivot. We've entered the inevitable phase of Russia-Ukraine war, where Russia is losing and major instability ensues. This phase is absolutely foreseeable. And then I think his take from the evening before, which was this: Russia will be weaker tomorrow than it is today. Ukraine will be better positioned to wage war and liberate Russian-occupied territory. That much is certain. And that's
what Putin's playing on. The Vindmans of the world are completely they're not just corrupt. They're not just morally misguided in how they want to use American military power overseas and globalist ties. Vindman, for those that don't remember, was the critical person that led to the first impeachment of Trump based on false accusations, because we'll get into it a little bit later with the Biden impeachment topic. The Trump was trying to inquire into the degree and scale of Ukrainian corruption before sending them any more money or arms, for which he was impeached for merely asking the question of Zelensky. And so what we see, and like the whole story of the Russian operation makes more sense now as things have come out, that originally Putin didn't plan on a long-standing war, that he went in as a feint because he believed, based on his own intelligence, I think that some of the stories of Ukrainian intelligence officers in Russia being fired is probably true, because he thought, we'll get a peace deal if I just put troops outside of Kiev, because Zelensky's just looking for an excuse to jettison the Azov battalion and the last vestiges of the Maidan coup regime. And my troops being outside Kiev will give him the pretext to do it. He sends a peace emissary up to Belarus, who actually agrees and signs the peace deal. And on his way back, and when he gets to Kiev, somebody in Kiev assassinates the Ukrainian peace initiative guy. Obviously, that wouldn't be the Russians, because they had no interest in that. Then they signed the same peace deal, comparable. And all it basically was is, we're going to denazify. In other words, take out the Maidan coup regime elements from the military, and from the political infrastructure of Ukraine. Don't join NATO. Scale down your armed forces. Going to be multiple security guarantees by everybody. Return to the Minsk Accords that keep Donbass in Ukraine and just make it Donbass have more political independence to protect Russian people's culture that is located within Donbass. And he was even talking about, leasing Crimea rather than declaring it part of Russian territory as part of the solution. The last part, not evident that was ever part of the ultimate agreement, but that's the degree to which Putin was willing to go, and thought that he had the deal twice, withdrew from Kiev because he thought that because they had initialed the deal in Istanbul, the second run around. And then Boris Johnson comes in and says no. What Putin underestimated was the degree of the Biden administration and NATO and Western Europe's commitment to using Ukraine to take out, so that they were on George Soros' script entirely. Soros has been doing this for 30 years, using Ukraine as his first place, as first template, and he's been obsessed with taking out Putin for 20 years. And he didn't, and Putin underestimated that. He didn't realize Zelensky's no longer an independent actor, that the entire Ukrainian regime now is effectively a colonial government of BlackRock, who is going to own half of Ukraine when this is all said and done on the current path under current agreements. A lot of these monies that we're sending over there aren't gifts, they're loans. Loans Ukraine can't pay back except to give us all their wealth. And in that sense, it's analogous to 1917, where what happened with the peace treaty that the Bolsheviks signed that gave up a bunch of Russian wealth and resources. So what happened is he was not well equipped to actually fight the Ukrainian war by last summer, and had to quickly make adjustments. And then they lost in those two counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson in the fall that showed how vulnerable they were. Since that time is when Prigozhin magically shows up on the scene as running Wagner, and has been giving out constant disinformation to the disadvantage of Ukrainians ever since. And anybody watching it could witness it in live time. But the Vindmans of the world so hate Russia, are so blind, hate Putin, that they cannot see it objectively. So they take the bait again and again and again and again.
One of my hypotheses was that, let's just say, the experts know that what they're peddling is disinformation. They know that they're making a mountain of a molehill, that it's not a real coup, but they can hype it up in short order, get everyone in a tizzy and a frenzy, much like with the death of those two Polish farmers at the hands of a Ukrainian missile that went astray. And they could say, look, if this coup succeeds, there are nuclear warheads in Russia that are going to fall into the hands of people even worse than Putin. It's going to be Prigozhin or Shogi.
But you saw none of them saying that.
None
of the Western experts said that. I mean, it was only independent observers that were saying it. Like that, I agree with you. Nobody sensible would actually want a coup in Russia, who understands Russia, that the alternatives in Russia are the Communist Party and the ultranationalists. The main criticism of Putin involving the Ukrainian conflict is that he didn't go in sooner and he isn't going in harder. It's nobody saying, please, let's end the war. Please, let's end the conflict. That's why I was curious to watch the Western response. All these so-called informed analysts, what they were predicting this would somehow be a good thing. 90% of the Ukrainian folks online were cheering it. Zelensky was publicly cheering it, and it's like, why? And I mean, if you think it really is a coup, that means it's the ultranationalists who want to nuke you into oblivion are taking over. Why is that a good thing? Yet you saw nobody say that. Not Vindman, not Lindsey Graham, not Marco Rubio. No, find the established Washington political figure who said it's a bad idea for this coup to occur. We should oppose it because it means nukes are now in an unstable regime. Nobody in that line was saying it. That shows you how delusional they are in their myopian hatred of Putin.
I had one more question. Is it true, Robert, as far as you know, that the Wagner Group is offering amnesty to prisoners? Come and survive 6 months and you get your freedom? Because I thought that was...
They wanted that to occur, but instead Russia didn't allow it, and they did it in a different way. It is probably true that there are aspects of Wagner Putin wanted to know who was trustworthy and who wasn't. And by the way, what Prigozhin has done has outed who in Wagner is untrustworthy and who is. That's the other thing that he likely did. And so most of Wagner signed on to new contracts to be under Russian military command. Those that didn't, some of them are getting sent to Belarus legitimately. I think some are being told to stay out of Russia and not come back because some overplayed their hands. I think if you're Putin, who you're concerned about is anybody in the high ranking of the military that might turn coat, anybody in the high ranking FSB, police, press, other places that might turn coat. But otherwise, your main concern is anybody high up that's real military, not Prigozhin, but real military in Wagner. that might be a problem.
All right.
Because mercenaries are always untrustworthy over time.
Am I wrong, or was the Ukrainian army not, in fact, the one handing out, AR-15s to free prisoners?
Not only that, they released like hardcore rapists and like extremely violent criminals that were not just not just gangsters, right, of that kind. So exactly how many people in Wagner come from Russian prisons has just been a big rumor. And no real confirmation of it. And I'm skeptical of a lot of these Russian-sourced informations because all of it seemed built to tell a story of, man, Wagner could be a trouble for Putin. Wagner could be trouble for Putin. If you're in the West, you better go over to Wagner and pitch what your proposal is for overthrowing Putin. And it appears we took the bait on it because that's how dumb our intelligence agents are.
All right. Well, I'm usually Putin. Okay, thank you, Winston Shittenhouse. So that ends our intro. Our intro. We're 50 minutes into this. That ends the discussion on the coup that lasted 12 hours.